Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday football podcast. I am Paul Perdichizzi, and thank you for joining me as always. Super excited to have a special guest returning back to the Saturday to Sunday football podcast. Let me bring him in, Mr. Danny Kelly from The Ringer. Danny, welcome back here to the Saturday to Sunday football podcast. Really excited to talk to you.
Absolutely. Likewise, can't wait to talk about this class. You're one of the people I trust and respect most in this industry. So honored to be on the show.
Absolutely. I've greatly appreciated all the support over the years. I love your work as well. So it's going to be fun just chopping it up a little bit, talking about these rookies. So let's jump right into it, talk about the wide receivers.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know the elite trio at the top. We know they're going to be at the top of, if anybody still got some lingering, rookie drafts to be had, but even more big picture on these guys, Harrison, Neighbors, Odunze. Obviously, we anticipate Odunze maybe coming along a little bit slower than the other two for like redraft settings. But how aggressive are you looking at these guys like Harrison and Neighbors to make an immediate redraft impact at a high end level? And how high, maybe even not specific rankings, but like, would you be really aggressive putting them up near some really proven youngsters in terms of like the dynasty landscape just because they're ceilings?
Yeah. I mean, I think Harrison in particular stands out to me as like day one impact guy, potential top 12 finish type of player, just because he lands in a situation with Kyler Murray, who I think is a really good quarterback. He's in an offense that doesn't really have any other big time standout players other than Trey McBride. Of course, those two guys are going to be kind of the focal points of the passing game for the Cardinals. But I think, Harrison, he has the skill set. I think he's got kind of like the size, speed, hands, route running combo to hit the ground running pretty early on in his career. And again, like I said, this is an offense that looked pretty good down the stretch last season. From I think it was like week 12 on, there's a 6-game stretch there where the Cardinals were top 10 in points per drive, points per game. I think it was passing yards per game and passing. I can't remember. There's one other thing. Basically, there was just a lot of things to be really hopeful and excited about going forward, I think, with this offense. And so Harrison Jr. to me kind of stands out above the rest. For Neighbors, obviously, love the talent, love the explosiveness, love the complete skill set he has, but I'm just not quite as certain about the Giants offense, where exactly they're going to be this year. Daniel Jones obviously needs to kind of still prove himself. So I think there's just more question marks with him. And then, like you said, Odunze is just kind of behind DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, at least for the time being. They might bring him along a little bit slower. Unfortunately, the offensive coordinator there comes from the Seahawks, and he did not do a great job of getting Jackson Smith-Njigba involved early on last season. I'm blanking on his name for some reason, even though he's the offensive coordinator of my team. What's his name? Waldron. Yeah, yes. Shane Waldron, who I'm already forgetting about because, I think Seahawks fans were just a little bit disappointed with how that whole thing went. But yeah, Waldron, coming off of last year where he basically didn't want to get Jackson Smith-Njigba involved in the Seahawks offense until like very late in the season. It's not super promising for what Odunze will do early on, but obviously two different players. And I think Odunze is a little bit higher level prospect. So we'll see how it all goes.
Yeah. I mean, these, it's staggering to see a wide receiver. I can't remember, maybe you can. Has there ever been a wide receiver going higher in redraft leagues in terms of their first year than Marvin Harrison? I mean, you're basically drafting him, that turn at the end of round 1, early round 2. Yeah. I mean, that seems like he has to hit everything, his ceiling, to basically be viable there. Would you be in on that in that like end of the first round, early second round? Or you're talking a little, you said you think he could finish top 12. Does that push him a little bit, maybe later round 2 for you if you were drafting right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, I'm probably not draft him in the first round. I think you're right now his ADP is basically like best case scenario. Like you're drafted him at his ceiling more or less. Obviously, there's anything could happen, and he could have like a Jamar Chase type impact early on, and then no one's going to regret that. But there's just not a lot of wiggle room with that. If he starts a little bit slow, if the offense isn't quite as good as it was at the end of last season or whatever, there's just a lot of variables at play here. And I'd rather go with a guy who's a little bit more established, one of these top tier elite fantasy players who've been proven, with their teams and in their offenses. And so I think I'm probably not going to be super in on Harrison from a redraft point of view, unless he falls into the second round somewhere and it looks like a value there. But yeah, I think you're kind of drafting him at a ceiling. The hype is just taking over for him.
Yeah, and I know you do a lot of work on these rookies before they get drafted. So before we move away from the big three wide receivers, we talked a little bit about Neighbors and his situation right now with the Giants. We talked about Odunze kind of being behind Keenan Allen and DJ Moore to get started here. If you took big picture dynasty perspective, would you rather attach yourself to Odunze, knowing that the start might not be as good, but he's attached to Caleb Williams, or the unknown of the Giants offense / quarterback, but Neighbors probably being locked in as that number one guy right off the bat? Do you revert back to your film evals on these guys? How do you kind of decipher that maybe long-term for dynasty now that we know they're landing spots?
I give Neighbors a slight edge just because of, I think, the skill set, the age. Obviously he did it a little bit earlier in his college career. He has it's like they're apples and oranges stylistically too. Like obviously Neighbors is like pure explosiveness, run after the catch. The ceiling is the roof with this guy in terms of like his potential. He kind of reminds me a little bit of Jamar Chase, just an explosive playmaker. And I think the sky's the limit. Then you have Odunze, who is more of a technician. He obviously tested well, but he wasn't like the most explosive run after the catch guy. That wasn't really a big part of his game. He's more of a possession receiver, red zone type of threat type of guy. So it's very difficult for me to choose between these two guys when it comes to dynasty. I think I typically will give the edge to Neighbors just because of the upside. But I think Odunze has a ton of potential, and I love the fact that he's connected to Caleb Williams, who I'm very confident in long term. So, I have them right next to each other essentially in my rankings. I think it just kind of depends on what you want, what you need year one. I think Neighbors probably his value is going to be higher year one, and so that's why I give him, I think, the edge there. But I like them both, and yeah, I'm looking at my rankings right now. I have them right next to each other, so it's kind of a quibble whether you like who you like more. But I think Neighbors' value is probably going to be a little bit higher right away, and so I give him the nod.
Yeah, and I think that's how most people are kind of looking at these top trio of wide receivers. I think some intrigue starts to come with the next trio of wide receivers that most people have in some order. If you have somebody different mixed in there, interested to hear, whether it's, we have Xavier Worthy, we have Brian Thomas, we have Ladd McConkey. I see people ranking them differently for redraft. I see people ranking for different, obviously, for dynasty. When you look at that trio of wide receivers, you could get the guy attached to the elite quarterback. You can get the guy in maybe the best situation for targets like Ladd McConkey. And then you have Brian Thomas, which maybe has the highest ceiling, but maybe not the highest floor because of, he's limited maybe in his route running right now and in aspects of his game like that he still needs to develop. How do you kind of look at Worthy, McConkey, and Thomas from a redraft and a dynasty perspective?
Yeah, I think all these guys, there's legitimate questions in terms of, their ceilings in the NFL early on and long term. And so this is like, you have like the three sure shot guys, the three top receivers in this class, and then you have a bunch of question marks. So I have Worthy ranked highest in my rankings for dynasty. Just because, like you said, he's attached to Patrick Mahomes. I think he's, got the early production on his resume. So I think there's a lot of signal that he's a very good player, good route runner, good receiver. He has that run after the catch ability. I think that's going to be big in this Chiefs offense in particular. I think he kind of fits what they want to do and get the ball out and definitely do some things out of structure. So I think Worthy is the guy I would give the nod to in this case, even though he does lack size. And I think that's a little bit concerning long term. And then I've got Thomas and McConkey right next to each other. I would have McConkey probably ranked over Thomas in redraft just because, I think in this offense, he's going to probably be the number one or the number two receiver pretty quickly here. And obviously they are an offense that's not going to be very pass heavy. If you look back at the Jim Harbaugh offenses over the years in the NFL, like they're almost always like 31st or 32nd in pass rate and total pass attempts. And so, the piece of the pie that he's going to be working with is much smaller than a lot of other players, but I just think McConkey has a chance to ascend pretty quickly and be a go-to guy in that offense. So I think McConkey's a pretty good sleeper in redraft, but again, it's hard to put him super high in dynasty just because of the situation where he's going to be playing, at least for 4 years in a pretty low volume passing offense. So that's the big question there. And then of course he has other injury concerns attached to him. He's not very big. And so I think that there's some big question marks there. And then, with Brian Thomas, I don't know. I think in redraft for me in year one, he's not like a big focus this year. I think he's probably more of like a not developmental necessarily, but like it might take him a year to really kind of like get ingrained in the offense. I think obviously they have Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk, kind of like the 1-2 punch in that offense. Add in Gabe Dave, maybe he's going to be a big part of this offense too. I don't know, but I think Thomas is more of a slow burn type of player.
Yeah, I think that's the way I look at it too. I have Worthy, McConkey, Thomas in that order. Probably McConkey and Worthy flip maybe for redraft, but
Yeah,
in terms of dynasty,
yep.
Worthy, McConkey, Thomas, and the name that I want to bring up that is not in that first 6 names that we talked about, but I think would be in that conversation, especially with the breaking news over the last hour or so. Mike Garafolo reporting Brandon Ayuk, requesting a trade. We'll see if the 49ers, pull the trigger. There's been a lot of smoke with, Ayuk in Washington. Where does Ricky Pearsall kind of fit into this? If we think that's going to end up happening now, like I think we all agree that he probably is in the next tier below. If everything stayed status quo in San Francisco, doesn't sound like that's going to happen. Where do you kind of, maybe, initial hot take right off the bat, if you haven't even, really thought about too much yet, where would you kind of slide maybe Pearsall into this mix here if we do see Brandon Ayuk shipped out?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think he'd probably get a pretty significant jump if that happens. And again, this is kind of like the Odunze factor here, where in Dynasty, especially, you have to take into account the value after year one and like how that is going to change and how that's going to shift. Obviously, if Ricky Pearsall comes in as like a starter from day one, his value is going to absolutely skyrocket because this is a really good offense, a schemed up offense that is going to get Pearsall tons of looks. Everything we've seen from Brock Purdy suggests that he's not like a fluke at this point. And so, yeah, I would probably move him up. I might even move him up over like a guy like Brian Thomas in Dynasty, just because you want a piece of that 49ers offense. You want a piece of that passing game. And even if they do trade Ayuk, Debo is not going to be necessarily super long for this world in terms of fantasy production and everything. He's getting up there in age. And so, there's a world in which Ricky Pearsall is the number 1 receiver within 2 seasons. And so I definitely move him up. I liked him a lot coming into the draft. Good route runner, tough, physical, fearless over the middle. I think all those things kind of work perfectly in this 49ers offense. I think he's a good fit for them. And so, I might move him up over Brian Thomas, Ladd McConkey in my dynasty rankings if Ayuk gets shipped off. And of course, he's going to move up significantly in redraft as well.
Yeah, absolutely. 2 polarizing wide receivers during the pre-draft months, I thought, were Keon Coleman and Xavier Leggett. The analytics people, whether it's talking about Keon Coleman's combine, whether it's the late breakout age for Xavier Leggett, what are some thoughts on those two? Were either of those guys that you liked in the pre-draft process? Were there things that were holding you back? And now we know they got pretty good draft capital, right? Obviously, Xavier Leggett, end of round 1, Keon Coleman right at the top of round 2. Some thoughts on those two.
Yeah, I think I had a really tough time with both of those guys. I kind of try and marry the analytical profile stuff with my tape watching when I'm putting together my scouting reports, my rankings, and both of those players are very just confounding in a lot of ways because you love the talent, you love the physicality, the size, of course, the explosiveness for both of them. I think Leggett in particular, you don't find many guys his size that can move the way that he does, but I think just looking at his analytical profile, like the number of players that have broken out as late in college as he has and still have, some pretty big question marks in terms of like route running, getting off of press coverage and the way that they're going to utilize him in the passing game. I just have some pretty major question marks about him going forward. That doesn't mean that he can't like emerge as a top tier player. And I think, you could have some of this similar concerns as we did about Ayuk coming out of the draft too, because he was, I think generally speaking, kind of like he's really explosive, not necessarily the most polished guy in the world, but he's just a big time athlete, run after the catch. He's a good fit in San Francisco. I remember having these discussions about Brandon Ayuk, and he turned into one of the best route runners in the league. And so maybe there is space for him to do that. I tend to be really, I guess, conservative with my ranking and my drafting of Leggett in Dynasty. I don't think I've gotten him anywhere, to be honest, just because I think there's just too many question marks about the late breakout, his route running ability, and just all those things, the way that they're going to utilize him. I didn't necessarily love the landing spot either. I think the landing spot could take a little bit of time in that offense, which is still, we're still trying to figure out if Bryce Young is even any good. And so I don't know. There's just a lot of things there. And then obviously with Keon Coleman, I think same deal. He's young, so he's got that going for him. I think that's a big factor here, and that's why I have him ranked over Xavier Legette. And obviously he lands in a great offense with Josh Allen, great quarterback. So I think I like him a little bit more than Legette. But again, he's just so many question marks about his production. His style, his role. I think a lot of people saw him more as like a big slot type of player, but then they're talking about him playing on the outside in Buffalo. I just think there's a lot of question marks about what he's going to do. So I think both those guys, Keon Coleman and Legette, I've basically been sort of avoiding in dynasty drafts just because I think their price is a little bit too high for me to feel really confident taking them in drafts.
Yeah, I think that I feel very similar about Xavier Legette as well. If he continues to fall in rookie drafts, I scooped him up in one place, but it was more of like just the value of a wide receiver taken in round 1 in an open depth chart that I just kind of pulled the trigger on it, but not really something I feel great about, but just more kind of like maybe I'm wrong in my evaluation on him, and he could develop into more than I see. 2 players that I've had a very hard time ranking post draft that I'm interested to pick your brain with is Jalen Polk, who ended up in New England, wide open depth chart, could see a lot of targets right out of the gate. And then AD Mitchell, who I liked a lot more on film, but ends up in Indianapolis, falls a little bit further on draft weekend than anticipated. Has an established alpha guy there in Michael Pittman. I was a big Josh Downs fan. I think he's a great, number 3 type slot wide receiver. And Anthony Richardson, a running kind of quarterback. When you look at Polk and AD Mitchell, do you lean towards now after the draft, no landing spots, the guy with all the opportunity right out of the gate, or is it Mitchell? Or maybe you didn't have Mitchell higher in terms of your film evals?
I think we see things similarly. I loved AD Mitchell on tape, but AD Mitchell was actually probably the hardest guy for me to evaluate in this entire draft because tape wise, his short area burst, his body control, his balance, his hands. There was so many things I really liked about him. But again, I do put stock in analytical profiles and production profiles and kind of like how predictive that has been going into the NFL. And like Mitchell's analytical profile was like awful. Like basically any way that you look at it, he was just not producing at a level that like a first or second round receiver typically does, or at least the ones that end up panning out in the NFL. And so he's kind of like my guy that I loved on tape, but like warning signs all over the place, like the lights going off in the back of my mind about like this is the type of guy that typically ends up being a bust in the NFL. And so I ended up just being sort of like lukewarm on him in my rankings. I have him below Keon Coleman and Legette and Jalen Polk. So like my rankings, it's Polk, Coleman, Legette right in a row, and then Mitchell right after that. And then again, it's like I loved his tape. I loved the way that he plays. I do think that there is a world in which he ends up being like a true number 1 and like a stud in the NFL. But I'm just a little bit worried because there's so many red flags with his analytical profile. And by the way, I didn't like love his landing spot too. I'm kind of with you there. It's like, yeah, they have Pittman, who they just signed to a big new contract. Downs, one of the more underrated receivers last year when he was healthy. And yeah, you're in an offense that is going to be like using the quarterback as a runner a lot. Like there's not necessarily a ton of volume to go around probably in this offense. And so it begs the question, like, what is the true ceiling for a guy like AD Mitchell? Is it like a wide receiver 2 type of guy? And that's, add in all the other like worries I had for him before the season. And I'm like, again, and this is a guy that I love, but I just have avoided pretty much in all drafts. I haven't got him, and I'm playing in a lot of leagues. So it just, I guess, shows you it's like I just don't have the confidence in the conviction on him that I think I should to get him in like in the mid second round. If he falls to the late second round, I'm all about scooping him up in super flex leagues. But before that, I'm typically going with guys that feel a little bit higher floors, and that's Jalen Polk. A guy I think is just a good, solid player, good landing spot. I like Drake May. I'm a fan of Drake May. I think long term he's going to be a good starter in the NFL. Polk can step in there and be like the reliable chains mover. He kind of reminds me of like a Robert Woods type of player, just a do-it-all player, not necessarily a superstar, but a guy that can just be solid and give them give May a target to like. He's going to run good routes. He's going to catch the football. He's going to get yards after the catch. He's going to be tough at the catch point. And he's the type of player that I think could develop along with May over the years.
Yeah, and I think what I've been adamant about Polk is he's probably a guy who is not geared to being a true number one. And he
Right.
might get thrust into that role at times this year, depending on, what they're, but I could see next year New England being in a situation very much like Carolina was this offseason, that we're going to have to go out there and we're going to have to try to make moves and trades or free agents. And I could see a scenario where we fast forward to age 65 and whether it's T. Higgins playing there or pick another free agent wide
Yeah.
receiver, or
Yeah.
they invest a first round draft pick, which probably puts Polk in a better situation, I think, to have long-term success, to be that number two, maybe for New England, once they have, have the ability to get, hopefully, Drake May, that true number one. So
Yeah.
I think, he's like that. I like the Robert Woods comp a little bit in terms of like, Robert Woods was never a true number one, but he played a really good role, had a lot of rapport with his quarterbacks. I could see that for Polk down the line. Final wide receiver question, and it could just be who are you ending up with the most, or who do you like the
Hmm.
most? Doesn't have to be straight rankings, but from some of these round 3, round 4 guys, I think they could be kind of talked about in a lot of different ways. We have Malachi Corley to the Jets, Troy Franklin to Denver, Javon Baker to New England, Jalen McMillan, Tampa Bay, Des Walker, Baltimore, Luke McCaffrey, Washington. Is there one or two guys from that list that you either find yourself ending up with a lot in your rookie drafts, you're intrigued with, you liked a lot in pre-draft, and you're intrigued to see how it plays out, even if you fell a little bit further than maybe you thought?
The two guys that I've ended up with the most, I feel like in my leagues, and of course this is always the big test, like how confident are you in your rankings? It's like the players you're actually picking on your dynasty leagues. I think the two guys that I've ended up with the most are Jermaine Burton for the Bengals. I don't know if you mentioned him, but he's a, I think, guy like I've been getting in the late second, early third. And then Jalen McMillan for Tampa Bay is another guy that I've just got a ton of over the last couple of months. I think McMillan, he's going to be in there. They're already kind of talking about him as like their number 3 guy from the get go. I think he's a good route runner, good hands. He's just like an all around good player. I don't think he's kind of in the same like mold as like a Jalen Polk. Like his upside is probably no more than like a number 2, but I think that can be really valuable, especially in half PPR and PPR leagues where he is just kind of like the over the middle guy. High leverage situations on third down. He's going to get open. He's going to catch the football. He's good at settling into those openings and against zone. He's got a little bit of toughness to him. He can do a little bit of run after the catch. He kind of just is an all around playmaker, but he just doesn't lack like the explosiveness. He doesn't have the explosiveness to be a number 1. But I like his upside as kind of like a number 2 type of player. And then, I think Burton, there's just a lot of question marks around him, obviously, from an off-field perspective. I think that's why he fell into the 3rd round, because he has a really good skill set, just vacuum grip hands, good route runner, good body control, great speed, good body, like good size. He kind of just is a complete package, other than, I guess, the question marks around sort of his personality and his off-field stuff. I think that's, generally speaking, what made him fall to where he fell in the 3rd round. But obviously he's going to have a big opportunity in Cincinnati if T. Higgins ends up going somewhere else, and it feels like that's probably the case. Is probably going to be what happens. And so I just have grabbed Burton in as many leagues as I can, because I think that the opportunity to pair his skill set with Joe Burrow's style as a quarterback, I think is pretty perfect. And obviously playing opposite Jamar Chase is going to give him a lot of opportunities to just be one-on-one with guys. And so Burton is a guy that I just picked up a ton.
Yeah, I think Burton is one of those guys that his value right now, where it is probably going to be the lowest it's ever, in terms of getting him right now, might be the lowest you ever have an opportunity to get him. Because if he shows some highlight plays in preseason, even if he has a couple moments here or there during the regular season, I think most people understand he's not going to have a lot of consistency in terms of fantasy production. But if we see glimpses here and there, and he stays out of trouble, and there's no character stuff that comes up,
right,
the writing's on the wall, like you said. T. Higgins going to be gone, and if Jermaine Burton steps into that role with the skill that we know that natural skill that he has, he's gonna be a lot harder to come by next year than he is right now. So yeah, I'm right there with, and I did forget to mention him when I was running down the other guys, but yeah, Burton is a guy right there. I'm right there with you. I think now's the time to try to get him. Let's shift this over to running backs, and right now Jonathan Brooks is for basically every ranking I've seen, is up there as the number 1 rookie running back. Before we maybe talk about him, was he your number 1 running back on film pre-draft?
He was, so he's my number 1 ranked running back in fantasy, but I had Trey Benson as my number 1 guy on film. I think it's like they were right next to each other. Oh, did you? Okay, that's good
Yeah.
to know. I mean, to me, like they're right next to each other, but again, this is like two guys that are very stylistically different in terms of Brooks and Benson. Like Benson is explosive, incredibly um, quick feet, tough, like good balance. But I think there are some question marks about like his vision and like how he's picking lanes and his propensity to like a bounce around or things like that. I think there's some reasons for concern, but I saw him personally as like a first round caliber type of running back, just in terms of explosiveness, speed, acceleration, contact balance, ability to break off the big play, ability to break tackles. I don't see a huge difference between. I think like in terms of some of the first round running backs we've seen over the last few years, I thought he was of that caliber. I understand why he fell to the third round. Like the running back in general has been devalued over the years, and I think there's enough question marks about his vision and success rate and some of those things that he fell. But I think like just from a physical point of view, he looks like a first round running back. But and then Brooks, to me, is obviously the injury is a big question mark, but he had a very, very balanced profile in terms of really quick feet, really, really good acceleration ability to like break tackles in like a phone booth, like in a phone booth. He's just so good at like making guys miss when they have him dead to rights. It seems like his footwork is so good. His lateral agility is so good. He can make players miss, and he can create on his own. Now he's not as explosive. He's not as I don't think he does has much like big play potential. But he has a really balanced profile, really balanced skill set. He's a good pass catcher. He's good in the passing game in general. And so I think he has a very bright future as an all-around pro. I just don't think he has the explosive traits that Benson has.
Yeah, and I think the crazy thing that I see with Benson is that, like, I feel like, and I sometimes do this as well, like if he would have been taken like 10 picks earlier and it would have had said round 2 draft capital, I feel like he would have been going higher in rookie drafts. And I don't know, I feel like people sometimes, and myself included, like we've seen a lot of round 3 running backs never really get an opportunity, but everything about Benson's profile, as you're talking about, screamed whether it was late round 1 or round 2, like I comp them a lot to Kenneth Walker. And I know you're out there, on the West Coast. Like I see a lot of Kenneth Walker to his game. And like we saw Kenneth Walker and Breece Hall go early round 2. Like if that's where Trey Benson went, like I think it would have been totally acceptable and would not have been a strong criticism from my end. And I'm sure a lot of other people, and because he slides this to the tippy tip of of round 3, I feel like he's became like this pretty good value, when I was doing rookie drafts where people were taking the wide receivers over him, where, like I said, if he would have been taken in the middle of round 2, where we're the same place where Jonathan Brooks was, he probably would have been going ahead of some of these other wide receivers. So I do think it's a little interesting. I'm right there. I had him 1, 2, Benson and Brooks pre-draft as well. I mentioned before that I've had a lot of hard time ranking A.D. Mitchell, Jalen Polk. I've also had that same issue with Blake Corum and Marshawn Lloyd. They both have guys that, in front of them. Obviously, Green Bay made the investment in Josh Jacobs. It's not really a 4-year deal, so I think there's some opening there. Obviously, we saw Kyron Williams be unbelievable last year, when he was healthy. And now Corum and Lloyd end up there. Of those two, who did you like more, maybe pre-draft? And what's your thoughts now in terms of where they landed?
I have them right next to each other. Of course, I feel like we're right on the same page with a lot of these guys. But yeah, I have Blake Corum ranked slightly higher than Lloyd. I think the problem with Lloyd is he has a much more apparent like downside case than Corum. I think because Lloyd is the big problem that he had in college was his fumbling. Like the amount of times he put the ball on the ground relative to how many times he touched it, it was like one of the higher fumble rates in college football. It's a huge concern. And especially in like the fantasy world, like if he gets into the doghouse, he fumbles a couple times early on. We might not see him until like year 2. You know what I mean? Like he could just end up being in the doghouse right away. And that is obviously going to be a massive detriment to his value in dynasty and his value in redraft, obviously. But that being said, I from a skill set point of view, I liked him more than Corum. So I had Corum slightly higher just because I think he has a higher floor and he's like a reliable guy. He does all the right things. I think he's the way that he showed some of he got some of the burst and explosiveness back towards the end of the season, coming off of that knee injury. I just think he has a higher floor in his career than a guy like Lloyd, who I think he's just a little bit more volatile. He could just like fall into like the RB3 zone if he just fumbles too many times. You know what I mean? And so I think Corum not as explosive, not nearly as I think like versatile in the passing game, things like that. Like Lloyd has a higher ceiling from a like an Aaron Jones role type of point of view, but I think Corum is just more of like a coach's best friend. So I've got Corum ranked slightly higher than Lloyd. I think that was how I had it in the draft as well. But I think Lloyd has a little bit higher ceiling just because of his skill sets. Like he's built like a bowling ball. He's super explosive. He can catch the football. He can create the explosive plays. But I just worry he's the type of player who could end up kind of just being forgotten because he has some high profile fumbles in the wrong spot and the coaches just decide not to play him anymore.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Those are obviously some of the drawbacks with Marshawn Lloyd and Blake Corum. I was talking about this on the last podcast with Dave Richard from CBS last week. If you really go down a checklist of traits between Kyren Williams and Blake Corum, besides receiving skills, Blake Corum probably checks the box over Kyren Williams at almost just about everything else. Now, it doesn't mean he's just going to be thrust over Kyren Williams, but Kyren Williams, thrived in that situation there in the Rams. If Blake Corum gets an opening, he's probably going to, thrive as well. And then you're going to talk about like, okay, well, who's better? And it's not impossible to see a scenario where Blake Corum at some point steals that job because he might be better at almost every skill than Kyren Williams. And that's not a knock on Kyren Williams. It's just, the reality of the situation in terms of, a checklist. And Kyren Williams, took advantage of the opportunity, and ran with it last year. But it's going to be interesting. Like that, we can't say that about Marshawn Lloyd, right? In terms of, Josh Jacobs. There's things that Josh Jacobs are clearly better than Marshawn Lloyd. It might only be a 1-year deal, but even if that's the case and they move on from Josh Jacobs, it's not like they might automatically here's the whole backfield of Marshawn Lloyd. That's probably not practical as well.
I think to add to that quickly, I think as you were talking, it just kind of dawned on me like Marshawn Lloyd, his ceiling is as a committee back. And Blake Corum, his ceiling is Kyren Williams, like breaking fantasy football. You know what I mean? Like because of the style of their coaching staffs, like the Packers almost always have a rotation at the running back position. That's just kind of how they do it. That's how they want to do it. They always invest in the running back spot. There's going to be multiple guys there. I think Lloyd, even if he's the best running back on the team, is still going to have to share the load. As we saw last year, Kyren Williams, even though he's like 190 pounds, he was a absolute bell cow for the Rams. If Kyren Williams gets hurt or if Corum just straight up beats him and Sean McVay decides he just likes Corum more, like he could get 80% of the workload in that offense and he could be an elite fantasy option. So that's kind of the difference. And again, that's why I have Corum slightly higher, even though like Lloyd, I think, skill set wise, I said earlier as a higher ceiling, I think skill set wise, he has a better skill set probably. But I think Corum from a fantasy point of view is going to have an opportunity to be like a bell cow type back. And Lloyd doesn't have that.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I agree with that assessment for sure. Most people have Jalen Wright at number 5. We know the deal with Miami. If you get an opportunity in that backfield, explosiveness, that's where most people have Wright. I think the intrigue gets after the top 5 because I look at my list and I say 6 through 13, 6 through 12. I think anybody can make a real argument for who they like in the next couple guys, whether it's just based on film eval, opportunity, scheme fit, anything. So, the names, the guys that were all the day 3 guys. I don't have to rattle them all off. A couple of the day 3 running backs that you're most intrigued with and why, whether it's their talent that you saw before the draft, it's the opportunity in the current depth chart or the scheme fit. A couple other day 3 running backs that you might be most intrigued with or like the most.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at the guys I got the most of in my drafts, again, Bucky Irving, the former Oregon running back, I think obviously his size and overall athletic profile are certainly concerning, and it's not something you can ignore. But I think his landing spot is great. He goes to a Buccaneers team that doesn't have a clear cut number 1 that like is too talented to like hold off any challengers. You know what I mean? Like I thought Rachaad White was like fine last year, but I don't think he had necessarily established himself as a top tier talent. He was just kind of a guy that ended up getting a lot of the volume there. And Bucky Irving, from a analytical point of view, like if you look at just his stats, his broken tackles, his pass catching ability, like he is pretty intriguing from a fantasy point of view, especially if he can get really involved in the passing game. So Bucky Irving is a guy that I've gotten a ton in the 3rd round. Audric Estime from Notre Dame, who ended up in Denver, is another guy that I really liked prior to the draft. I think he has an opportunity, maybe not this year, or he does have an opportunity this year, but like going forward after next year. estimate could end up being the starter in Denver. I think he's got that skill set, the size, the explosiveness, the power, all that stuff. I've gotten quite a bit of Tyrone Tracy for the Giants. I think and again, it's like you're looking for the type of skill set that could be a factor in fantasy, and he's really good pass catcher, former receiver, ton of athleticism, explosiveness. So he's been a guy that I've been looking for. And then, of course, I didn't have him ranked this high early on in the process, but Braylon Allen has made tons of noise for the Jets, it feels like, in training camp. There's just sort of like a buzz about him right now that you can't ignore. I had him ranked in my top 100 coming into the draft. I think just like from an overall skill set point of view, like he checks a lot of boxes. I don't think he's like a superstar in any one skill, but I think he has the size, the footwork, and the toughness to be like a high volume type of player in the NFL. And so I think you can't ignore Braylon Allen, even though he's clearly going to be stuck behind Breece Hall. If Breece Hall gets hurt, I think he'll have an opportunity to like kind of surprise some people. So he's another guy that I'm trying to get. Like he's a 4th round type player, and I think that's a good value for me.
Yeah. Some of those guys, I've been getting a lot of Tyrone Tracy. Audric Estime is another guy that Denver situation seems pretty wide open.
Yeah.
But yeah, Braylon Allen's a good call. Bucky Irving. Last question for you, Danny. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about one quarterback question, especially being out there on the West Coast. You saw a lot of Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix playing out there, in college there. What's your take on them? Is do you have a clear preference in dynasty leagues between the two? We know one's obviously going to get the immediate opportunity and one is unknown. But quick thoughts on Penix versus Nix and what you like most about who you like most about those two.
So I have Penix. Sorry, I have Nix ranked slightly higher in dynasty just because I think again it's a matter of he's going to get an immediate chance to be the starter there. I think his skill set too is probably a little bit more in tune with what you're looking for in the fantasy point of view, because he ran a lot. He's a big, tough, good athlete, type of guy who can like score some rushing touchdowns and kind of add to his score in a fantasy point of view from that. I think if I was talking like pure upside, though, I like Michael Penix a little bit more. I'm kind of willing to take a risk on Penix in the 2nd round of dynasty drafts, superflex dynasty drafts, because he obviously is going to probably be sitting for most of this season, but going forward after that, like he's going to be in an offense that has Drake London, has Kyle Pitts, has a Ram style, coaching tree that you're going to be coaching him of a ton. I think he's a good fit for what they want to do. So I'm willing to take a risk on him, even though, the timeline for him starting is like much murkier than some of these other guys. So I think, Nix has a floor that you can't deny because he's probably going to be a starter in year 1. I think he's a very accurate and efficient type of quarterback that, especially in a Sean Payton type of system, could score some fantasy points and like give you like a solid floor as like a quarterback 2 in a super flex league. I don't know if he has the upside to be ever turn into a quarterback 1, but I kind of like taking a gamble with Penix just because I think, from an overall upside type of point of view, he has that aggressiveness, accuracy down the field, and he's in a system with some good skilled players that I think he could kind of surprise people going forward in 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. What we saw like from Tua last year, like would that be inconceivable to think that could be Penix in a couple of years? And I don't think that if they have the offense set up and the play caller and the scheme set up, I think that could easily be Penix in a couple of years. So I'm right there with you in terms of ceiling long-term dynasty upside. Danny, thank you so much. This was a real pleasure to have you make some time to hop on here at Saturday Sunday and talk with us. Please, I'm sure most of my audience is following you, but let them know where they can follow you. If there's anything specific you got working on here during the summer, anything you want to push or promote.
Yeah, you can check me out at theringer.com. We have a fantasy football guide that is up, and then we're going to be doing a huge update to it, adding a bunch of profiles and our ranks. You can find my dynasty ranks, my dynasty rookie ranks at that as well. It's fantasyfootball.theringer.com. And then check out our podcast. It's the Ringer Fantasy Football Show, which we are going to be starting to do 3 episodes per week pretty soon here.
Guys, make sure you're checking out all of the great work that Danny and the rest of the team over there are putting out. So on behalf of Danny, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nakano, and myself, thank you for joining us. And we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.